It is a minute after 4. So welcome everyone who has signed on to a Friends from the Field webinar. This webinar series is co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and I'm the outreach coordinator for Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and Island Heritage Trust. And normally Jake, the Island Heritage Trust volunteer coordinator and officer manager, is with us co-facilitating, but he can't be here today, unfortunately. But thank you all for showing up. So we have a chat box, and I'm just going to invite you to introduce yourself. You could share your name, where you're from, why you're interested in this topic, so we kind of get a sense of who's in our online community today. And just a note about using the chat box, you can send a note to just the panelists or to all panelists and attendees, just so there is a distinction so you're aware of that. We'll have a Q&A at the end, a question and answer at the end. But you can be typing in questions into the chat box that I can ask Barbara toward the end. And I think all of you should have a little blue raise your hand icon that at the end, if you'd like to ask Barbara a question yourself, you can raise your hand, your blue hand, little blue hand, and I can unmute you to do so. So I think I have covered everything that I should cover that Jake normally covers. And I'm super excited to introduce our speaker today, Barbara Putnam. She is an artist and a teacher at St. Mark's Catholic School. And then Barbara has a friend along with her from Venice, Italy, I believe, and she's going to introduce him as well. So thank you, Barbara, so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much to Blue Hill Heritage Trust and also to the Island Heritage Trust for inviting me. I'm really honored. I would like to introduce Dr. Luigi Bundone, who is a scientist and researcher from Venice, who he's on the call with us today, and he can also answer some of the questions at the end. And I'm just going to launch right in. I am an artist and a teacher, an art teacher, and I teach high school age students at a boarding school. It's not a Catholic school, we have all faiths there, called St. Mark's, and it's located just outside of Boston. And I'm going to divide this talk into 2 parts. The first part is how I became interested in science in my own work, and the second part is how I combine science and art with the students. Why is this not advancing naturally? There we go. Wondering if, well, we'll see what happens as we go here. So growing up, my dad talked about all the time the creative problem solving in surgery, beginning with observation and materials, and he had a sense of wonder about how the human body is assembled. My mom worked for the Harvard bacteriology lab when I was little, and we always had, in addition to encyclopedias, we had an open bird book at the kitchen window. And let's see, okay. I've been trying to get myself a little bit organized here. It's a little challenging here, but I've spent the last 35 summers and 2 sabbaticals tied to Deer Isle. Every inlet on this island, as those of us who know from Blue Hill, or if you're on the island, is different, and it responds to the beauty of constantly changing seasons, weather, and even the tides. And Stonington, for those of you who aren't from around here, is an active, very active and vibrant fishing community where all the stakeholders are working extremely hard to keep it sustainable. And as an artist, I've always been interested in how things work. So I have 3 main areas of focus in my own work. One is black and white woodcut, which is essentially analyzing what I see, drawing with a knife instead of with a pencil on wood that is about 3 feet by 4 feet. And I also work in textiles, which are pieces that allow me to look at a little bit differently at my senses and lean a little bit more into color. And this particular piece looks at the fishing out in this area, in the Gulf of Maine, of cod, haddock, and pollock. So I'm also looking at, and now working with woodcut directly into these pieces that are on textiles, which involve cyanotype, and working with dyeing fabrics. And the piece on the left actually is looking at bladderwrack and how bladderwrack is, with a graph in the middle of it, tracing in that green line the pathway of the seaweed as it gets really, really intensely growing in the spring, that narrow column of brown. And then it goes down in the summer because of predation, which is the blue line that goes through it, of all the wonderful little critters and turtles and tiny fish that are in there eating it and for nourishment. And then there's a sense of equilibrium and it returns in the fall. The work on the right is more looking at jellyfish and some of the invasives that are coming into our oceans. But I also have an ongoing series of things we think about a lot with the planet and climate change, with things that are scarce or rare or disappearing. And so I did the opposite. I started working with things that we have a lot of. And until this spring, this is what our transfer station looked like on the island, full of plastics and metals. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about what we think we're throwing away and we're not. And the car is a handy sort of size model for me. But I've titled these pieces with the latitude and longitude lines so you know exactly where it is. And the word midden, which means if you find a shell midden on the island, you're really thinking about something that a culture in the past has left behind. So I put you, the viewer, in the position of looking back on our culture now and what we're leaving behind for posterity. And it may hopefully help people think. I also work in a third area, which are collaborative projects. And this particular collaborative project, called Quiet Skies, went to San Francisco a couple of years ago, and it involved an ornithologist, a composer, who's pictured there in black with the really horrible pizza we were eating, 2 printmakers. And the strength of collaborative work, I think, is the give and take between all of the people. There's a trust that has to grow between the group. And it's also an opportunity to work across disciplines and fields. And it's central to what I do in my teaching now. So Quiet Skies involved data. There were 5 channels of Savannah sparrow recordings that one of the collaborators worked with that spanned 38 years. And Nathaniel Wheelwright, who works at Bowdoin, was one of our collaborators, and he donated the data. And Richard Cornell, who is there with the pizza, he was the one who put these into the 5 channels. The mural is divided into 3 vertical parts, which reflects bird song, which is divided into 3 parts as well on song maps. And then Deb, who's up above on the stairs, she made a lot of digital prints of the desert elevations and nests. And I was working with skeletal suggestions and fabric of the birds. And on top of this, Deb made a movie of water, which she made back into line and then up into something that's a little more dense to interact with the wall piece, which we obviously had all the lights out. And then Richard made a wheeling flock of birds with a mathematical formula. And those are, you'll see, go across the piece. And then Deb's genius was we had a microphone planted in the middle of the room so that if anybody talked during the whole loop of the presentation, the birds disappeared. And that was our symbol for the anthropogenic kind of interference that we have in a lot of our world and in a lot of our species. And so this is about the migration of these birds as they're trying to go over the desert maps, which were once oceans. I'm going to play for you a couple of about 10 seconds of this so you get a sense of what the piece looked like we had. So hope you have your sound up. Okay, I think I'll stop it there. You can see that we use the triangles as we see those on a daily basis as caution signs, and the work actually, because of the darkness and the completely surrounded you with the sound, was pretty powerful to us, and we hope also the people who saw it. Okay, so in my life, I draw all the time. Sometimes it's analytical, looking at this, in this case, during the COVID lockdown, how a tree could still stand up and be completely almost disintegrated. And then I also fill journals with studies of people. A lot of the time, my favorite place to go is to a restaurant and draw people, and sometimes in preparation for a print, but most of the time it is a place where I can entertain myself for hours. But importantly, it keeps my hand fluent and my eyes alert all the time. So I go to places where people are waiting, and that I find to be endless entertainment for hours. This was Christmas time in an airport. And I make composites of people. So that means that the suitcase in the front doesn't belong to anybody anymore because that person left. And head and feet and some of those other parts of people are interchangeable. But what I'm able to get from this is that's different from photography is photograph will get you a moment, but I'm actually doing something that spans a sense of time. And a huge plus is access. So imagine if you were to board an international flight with a camera. Would you get into the cockpit? I don't think so. So I go in, and while this particular flight was on a gate hold, liquor was being passed out as people were complaining about an unavoidable event. And I was chatting with the co-pilot, drawing, which amuses them as well. And he was talking to me about what all the magenta writing was about, which was that what the plane was actually telling the pilot that the plane was going to do in order to get itself off the ground, which is probably too much information that any of us want to know, but I found it fascinating. And important here is that as much as possible, I work on site and in real time. And though you may be seeing a drawing, I'm using all of my senses. So smell, sight, sound. And I ask the same of my students to work in live and also to notice the world around them in real time. So my interest comes from a couple of residencies. Here's the first from Manitoba in Canada in 1997. I was invited to test an idea that they had for an artist residency at the research station on 200 hectares of wetlands. And I was embedded with PhD students and postdocs who were studying waterfowl migration and habitat. The director could see value of art as a communicator, and these experiences changed me because I was in the labs looking at how they were researching, what they were looking at. I had access to data, and we talked and we ate together. We exchanged ideas and questions with a respect for each other's curiosity and for each other's different knowledge base. We talked endlessly about how we observe and how we discover difference in something that is really familiar to both sets of people, but we speak about it differently. And I would go out and draw on top of the car on a platform. And that was 6.5 feet off the ground, got you out of the range of the unbelievable amount of mosquitoes that were there. And I didn't make fun of them. They didn't make fun of me because they were up to their neck in waders waiting for a duck to move. So I went outside and recorded, and this is one of the woodcuts from that summer, wind and rain and how the grasses gradually were letting in more and more sky. I was afraid of sky at first because being a good New Englander, we don't see very much sky. And here it was absolutely flat. I was amazed by that. And the Phragmites, and I learned about the ecosystem from the other participants. The second summer I went out there, I started to chase the weather. The storms came in cycles, and they were powerful in their beauty. I chased this particular storm 90 miles down a dirt road, and I stopped just behind the rain line to capture what I don't think you can catch with a camera, and that's an 11-second, 12-second drawing of a storm, and I have pages of this watching that storm as it developed. And then I drive 5 miles to catch up with it, and I learned at this particular storm at dinner that it took the tops off of several grain elevators on the way to Winnipeg. So from that second summer, I focused on the weather, and these are pretty big prints. This is the storm headed for St. Ambrose, and the storm passed overhead. I sat in my car and waited for it to go by, then climbed up on the car with the wood, and it flattened everything in its path. And you know, there's a special smell after a thunderstorm passes over. And I had seconds to record these clouds as they were rumbling on towards the Winnipeg, essentially. And that's where the sketchbook comes in handy, because when you're drawing very, very quickly in a restaurant or someplace where people change, you get used to what the critical marks are that you need to have on the page in order to get this down. So drawing on the wood, that made that possible, except I'm using my whole arm instead of using just my fingers and my hand. But I knew from this experience in 1997 that I would always want to be in the company of scientists. And it's when I began to bring scientific thinking into the classroom. The second experience in 2012, this is much more recent, was an expeditionary residency I went on. And this was formative also. At least it really helped shape and confirm some of the things that I do in the class today. So we went with it was an international competition that drew and selected 24 people to go aboard this tall ship, which doesn't look like too bad a deal, right? And it was expeditionary with scientists and architects and musicians and artists all together for about 3 weeks, excuse me. And this is a really great lesson in ocean circulation right here, because I don't see any trees out here and you don't see any trees. And yet here are a bunch of logs, and you learn that this is wood that has come in from Siberia. I had never, ever been in wilderness like this before. And the silence and the fact that there were no other people that we came in contact with for over 2 weeks, 3 weeks. There was no Wi-Fi. And we were also responsible for each other's safety. And we had people that would go out before we landed on one of the shores to check for polar bears. But we had certain commands that we all had to know and be able to use with each other to keep everybody safe. This was the ice. It was one morning outside my window. I could hear this thumping that was as it woke me up. And this was outside the window of the boat. And ice is sculpture. It's nature's way of sculpting that involves the effects of wind and time. And we could see it as it was coming out of the edge of the glacier. First, you hear what sounds like a pencil breaking. You know, I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I have, where you hear a pencil break and then a bookcase falls down off the wall. This is kind of the same thing, because in the deep throat of that glacier, you can feel this groaning and you can hear it. And then it comes down. And we were in these little pontoon boats. One little pontoon boat would go out a night, and there'd be 6 of us in it. And you can imagine our eyeballs popping out as this came down, because the sound is quite amazing. And nutrients here are released. The boat, meanwhile, is going up 3 stories and then down 3 stories with refrigerator-size ice coming at us and going underneath. So we sounded like a giant martini glass with it pinging on the metal underneath. And we had the seals would come up because they could feel the vibrations underneath the water of the calving, and they wanted the released nutrients that had been under pressure for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then the birds would come in also to get their share of the food. And then what would happen closer to shore were what we would call Birdie Bits. And these are, some of them made it to shore, and they looked like chiseled arrowheads. There was absolutely no end to the fascination with these little guys, all different, and they looked like they had been sculpted. There was, if you have a chisel at home, it makes the same mark that the wind was making as well. And then I would sit out, we'd go out for 3 hours at a time, and then we'd have to come in and warm up. And I was fascinated by things like reindeer who had just left behind their antlers and walked away. And I made prints from that. I realized, the full disclosure here is I carved this once I got back, because although I brought my knives with me, I couldn't carve on board because I forgot that a boat is always moving, and I would have done something and hurt myself probably. But I did the drawings right on the wood and brought them home and carved them there. One of the last days that we went on shore, on one of the last mornings, we saw frozen jellyfish, which is evidence, and it really surprised the people who were on shore with us, who were checking for the polar bears, because they had never seen it before. But it was really evidence of a warming thermal environment. And when I checked when we got back, it was true that this was the warmest October that they had ever seen. So those photographs I had printed onto fabric. I cut them up, and I joined them with fabric that I had dyed by wrapping around lobster trap parts. And that became the subject for the quilt entitled, What If They Had Lived? And I think if you think of a quilt as shelter and warmth and something that's traditionally made by women, here I simulate a graph and propose a conversation in a mixed language here of biology and art. So as I bring concepts of environmental stewardship into the classroom, this being the second part of my talk, I think about these images a lot. The one on the left I took hiking in the Italian Alps on top of Monte Viots in the upper left-hand corner of Italy, as I look at a map, in July of 1978. On the right is an image of the same location, taken the same month, about 6 years ago, that I got off the web. On the left is my benchmark for global warming, and on the right is the baseline for what my students may reference if they are lucky enough to hike here. Okay, so here's a bunch of students in 2016. Actually, this may have been a little bit earlier than that, but it's a class who graduated in 2016 and completely powered up by Starbucks as I was bribing them on their way to some research endeavor. And one of the drawings I asked them to do was one day to save all of the plastic that they could use or had used for an entire week, to save it. And then they brought it into the classroom and we made individual still lifes with it. So we had glue guns and they glued it together. And that brought to them, first of all, some self-knowledge of their own individual footprint on the environment. And then I asked them to set the composition underwater in the ocean. And we read about plastics washing shore. These kids graduated in 16, but this was in 2014 because I know which class it was. Claudia on the right came roaring in one of the days and not taking this anymore. I can't wear this anymore. It has microbeads in it. I just found out what microbeads were. And she broke a little bit of pieces of glass from some slides that I gave her. And she put that, embedded it in the painting. So it went on the wall, it actually caught the light with sharp edges to her brush strokes, which I thought was a pretty cool way of making the feeling of this seem a little bit more urgent and kind of hard-edged. The students, as they became advanced, their next year, they were working on individual projects, and several of them chose to work about plastics and ingestion or about the oceans. And these kids, you know, thinking pretty far back, these kids find art to be a powerful language, and they really understand the significance of the human impact. They're not thinking about the oceans as infinite as I did as a kid. And I don't know what path they're going to take once they get to college, but having a rich and varied content in what they are looking at and to make sure that they've got the proper skills developed to be able to talk about it, it can, and I think it will affect decision makings that they will make in many different fields. I think of art, though, it's experiential all the way. And this is going back to those kids on the bus. This is Rory. And he was interested in 2014, he was interested in bees because that was a year that we were worried about what was happening to all the bees that were supposed to be pollinating. And so I took him to a friend's house who keeps bees, and he firsthand was able to photograph, lift the frames, and see firsthand what beekeeping was all about. And that affected his work. So all of his work that year came from photographs that he had taken. Most of the time, though, our students teach us, the teachers. And this is a student, Unsu Ko, who is happily now going to go to the University of Chicago Graduate School for printmaking next fall. And I took these kids at the end of the year to a farm to draw. And she drew some of the goats. As you can see, she sat inside the pen. But then the rest of this print is about consumption, with a goat looking out the lower right-hand corner, kind of eyeing us with a little bit of suspicion. And on the right, she takes you to what she calls a tree zoo, which is an imagined garden of one tree and somebody there having a picnic underneath it because there are no other trees that are left. And that's a student from a little while ago. So they totally get it. And this is my favorite and toughest group to teach because they're first-year students. Most of them have not drawn before and they have wide open minds, but very few fine motor skills, because then students that I've had in the past, because they don't grow up with coloring books. They grow up with keyboards and other kinds of things that they're playing and doing. So every year, after they get some basic color theory down and some awareness of composition, we focus on a different environmental and ocean kind of issue. So on the left in 2016, when Obama signed that historic Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, we focused on that. And on the right, we focused last year on 7 marine turtles. And I give these, if any of you are interested in these assignments, I'm happy to send you PDFs. Believe me, this would be great to share. But I have them read, first of all, and look at a couple of websites that will keep them out in their own search, to keep them away from the, keeps them out of trouble with looking at sites that are actually restaurant sites instead, and give them a little bit of basic information. And then their task is there at the bottom. But they learn about paraphrasing visual images first, and they have to set these in the real world, not in an ocean tank. So they've got to be careful as they are looking online. And they also need to write a written statement on their chosen subject with its Latin name, its status, and also what are the threats to its habitat and threats to the species as they've been painting and learning about it. So they construct that painting, as I said, out of multiple images, which is paraphrasing, the parallel to paraphrasing if you're working with text. And then they have to use color and composition as tools to make something that's both a work of art and also a work that's readable and appreciable by scientists. So framed, these are works that we celebrate within the school community. They're exhibited there, and hopefully educate some of the students if they take the time to read. And I've taken several sets of these since my sabbatical to Bowdoin in 2012 to show in their Coastal Studies building. So this year, though, the students got really lucky. A NEAC, or New England Aquarium scientist, Roz Rollins, contacted me, and she thought I might be interested in a workshop that was going to take place in Barcelona. And so this year's lucky students partnered for the first time directly with a scientist, and they partnered with Dr. Luigi Bondone, who is the founding director of Archipelagos Italia. He is an environmental biologist, and he is studying the world's most endangered pinniped, the Mediterranean monk seal. He estimates that there are about 360 individuals left. So that's their assignment sheet. And over the summer, I sent him a proposal, which he accepted. And then I got to work reading all I could find out about the Mediterranean monk seal, because I knew zero about them, and was delighted to find that they were in warm water. I was bummed to realize that they are extinct in some places in the Caribbean, and that there are so few of them left in the Mediterranean. And then I went and made a presentation for the students. And this is one of the slides that I had them look at, because I had to go through the same idea of, what are these seals? There are 3 monk seals in this slide, but I asked the students to help figure out which ones they are based on what could you tell from here that would indicate that was maybe something for warm water. And so the harp seal, the Waddell seal, the elephant, and the monk seal are all here. And I introduced them also to the history and some of the vocabulary they would need in order to read articles. And I've been teaching art history for years, but I didn't know in the Lascaux caves or in the Altamira caves in Spain that at the same time, in roughly 10,000 BCE, that people were making drawings and carvings of the Mediterranean monk seal, because they were using them for fuel and their skins for meat, and then also for ritual way back then. So they've been recorded since that time. And then the last slide in the slideshow that I gave to the students to get them started was that their job as scientist artists, and that they were going to be educating the public, and that this was work that was very, very important. And I also realized that, one of the first things that you do with something endangered is try to help kids fall in love with the species. So this is the students who are in the first week researching. They went all over the internet looking at habitat, numbers, issues to study. They went into small groups to figure out if they wanted to focus on the Mediterranean, something that the monk seals ate, or whether they wanted to look at plastics. And they learned a lot together, and they pooled their resources to figure out what were some of the things that were common to what they were seeing, and things that were going to pertain individually to their work as a whole. And Luigi took time out for 2 extended Skype calls. And the students, I asked the students that they could not make any questions that could be found, the answers could be found directly on the internet. So I have a copy here of a couple of the questions that they did ask. And Luigi gave such a lot of his time to them. And the students could feel his love for this animal. They also could feel the urgency of his work, and that it was palpable. But a couple of the questions, and as I said, I asked them not to ask a single question that they could find the answer to online themselves. So Jenny asked, what is their place in the ecosystem? How does the monk seal's survival affect other species? And Madison asked, does plastic affect their interaction with other seals? And Luigi took this, and I have a whole sheet full of the questions to document what they had asked, and he answered them each one, and each student felt that their questions were not only heard, but then they were starting to look at this project as not something that you did for a grade or to figure out something about color, but to figure out something that was relating themselves to a real issue and a real person. So it really solidified their commitment. And then Luigi sent us slides that introduced the students to fieldwork and what fieldwork is all about. And he showed us this study area. He's working mostly on the western coast of Greece, but here's his camera, and using the infrared cameras that I will show you in a second. But he took us to one of the caves so that the students could see what his study area was like. And he taught them a bit about the difficulty of studying an animal that is very, very curious, but we have to be left in the wild. We can't go near it. They also saw the lack of glamour and the challenge of getting information and getting things into a particular study area. So the infrared is when the students realize, oh, he's working in complete darkness here with a headlamp. And that made an impression. And what he showed them also were some of the cameras focused on the seals, where the aims and shows the seals coming and going from some of these caves. And they were able to ask questions back and forth to Dr. Bondone via email. And that kept their collaboration alive and made it real. And here we are actually now up on the board. So these works really helped the students figure out a composition and how they were going to picture the seal with some of the things that they had learned by other means. And that was important. So here they are working, developing, and actually being in contact with Dr. Bondone throughout this project, and asking questions, coming in for extra time to figure out color and habitat, and remembering some of the slides that I had shown them of plastic washing ashore. This is off the shore of Greece. And then here's some of the results. So the students finished their paintings, and they were ready for exhibition. And one of the students made an essay that was to accompany the exhibition, summarizing their methods of research and their experience. And they also let me know that they could feel a deep frustration with my generation for messing things up. Well, while all of this was happening, these 3 students, who are advanced students, caught on, and they wanted to be part of this whole thing. So they were doing an after-school program with me where they were working on individual projects. One comes from Newton, one comes from California, and the student in the center comes from Beijing. But they wanted to work on this. They had done coral bleaching 2 years earlier. So they were curious, just like the monk seals, and they wanted to participate. So Jenny, I asked them to make a color reduction print, because they've done that before, and they thought that would be a good way to work. And they made a multicolor print from a single block of linoleum, which you can see down in the lower left. And in order to do that, you have to think backwards twice. Once every time you print, the image is mirrored or reversed, but also you have to think backwards from the start of the project. So Jenny prints on number 1 colors that she wants in her somewhere in the background, and they need to be the lightest colors. So she prints these on her 10 sheets of paper, and then she carves out whatever she wants to keep that color, and then prints her second color on top of that, which retains the transparency. There's transparency with the colors as she's mixing it, but it retains some of the color that she's left there. And then so on, reducing the block, which is why it's called color reduction, and yet building the color on those prints. It's kind of complicated. And these are the 3 prints that came out. And the students asked me if they could give these prints to Dr. Bundone in appreciation of the work he is doing for the monk seal. They couldn't donate money, but they could certainly donate their work and their love. So I took a suitcase the size of a garage full of their work, my work, and all of this to Barcelona, Spain, to the World Marine Mammal Conference. And the following slides that you're going to see are what I brought back to the students. I promised to be their eyes for them at the conference. So this is a room, and this is what it looks like. This is my picture of hope, because this is a room with over 3,000 scientists from 95 countries, hosted by the Society for Marine Mammalogy and the European Cetacean Society. And they were looking at issues of polar ecology and communication in marine mammals, feeding ecology, plastics, pollutants, microplastics, the effects of noise, and new technologies, and a whole host of other, even including veterinary medicine in this whole conference. There were 16 different themes. And I think as a picture of hope, I'm going to play a little bit here on the left.
For captive care takes years and should be initiated before you need it urgently. Exito was a last-minute effort in the face of extinction. Too few animals left to take a precautionary approach, and learning curve is steep, and we didn't have to have a learning curve.
So fortunately, the language was English, but I get the chills every time I see that slide of that many people who are really trying to conserve the waters and the habitat in the ocean worldwide. This was a room where the buzz went out that there was going to be something really cool shown, and I went, and it turned out to be something off the coast of Boston in Stellwagen Bank. And it was a packed room, and you have to imagine here a packed room where you could hear a pin drop of scientists. And it was the first documentation of coordinated bottom feeding by humpback whales, and it was led by a team with David Wiley of NOAA. And what he shows you in the area in the upper left is how these humpback whales are so large, and they all want to share the same feeding area. They dive down, and there's a ballet that takes place underwater, which we got to see. I can't show you because it hasn't been published yet, but there were GoPros on one of the whales' heads, and they went down to the bottom, and they all rotate at the same time to the right, and then they all come up together in this aquatic ballet where they don't touch each other, but they're within inches of each other. And that was the first time I had heard in a room of 200 plus people all knowing about this research, hearing them sigh and exhale, as I was definitely doing at the same time. So I went to a workshop, an all-day workshop on what's called RAPCON, which stands for the Rare Pinniped Conservation Network. And I was telling my students about Dr. Fernando Aparicio of Spain, who was a scientist and inventor of a device. He cracked open the device that could track the movements of monk seals for up to a year, designed to self-corrode and land at the bottom, and then could be picked up. You'll notice that's my coffee cup for size. This is leather lined so that there was absolutely no chafing on the seals. And here you can see Fernando and a colleague disguised as sand. I love that. And they are exchanging out an old monitor for a new monitor before it fell off and to be replaced. And they took about 8 hours creeping up to this sleeping seal. And it is, I think, on Cabo Blanco. Luigi can correct me later if it isn't, but I think so. And where they actually can haul out in sand, not in caves. And so they creeped up on this, they make the exchange. All the seal did was look its head up and then put it down again. And it was bored. They made no difference at all. And I asked a question because they're kind of big. I said, what's the effect on the seal? 5 pounds is a lot to me. And they quickly reminded me that if I weighed maybe 550, 640 pounds, I wouldn't notice a 5-pound bracelet. In our workshop, we were exploring art as a tool for communicating marine mammal science. And this was organized by Dr. Bondone and Volker Schmidt of Berlin. The objective was to share and communicating marine mammal science to both the general public and within the scientific community. The presentation here on the left by a musician from St. Andrews, and then on the right, a musician and composer from Rome. And they were using marine mammal sounds and oceanic sounds in both of their original compositions. But Dr. Bondone had presenters that represented museums and researchers who were also artists, and shown are also 2 composers, as you can see, who also were able to bring us into this whole topic with sound. This is Ursula Pritter, and she is from Switzerland, and she works on minke whales. And she's a scholar, but also she is a sewer, and she makes life-size mammals to teach children and adults about the underwater world most of us never see. She has children count how many can stand beside each other, beside an orca, and she places the animals in order of predation, all the way down to some of the smallest creatures that are at the bottom of the food chain. And she hung the animals that she works with on the window, and there were more selfies taken here at the conference than anywhere else in the group. So all of our students saw these slides, and this is our group. This is the most exciting group of people I've met in a long time, where we represent Italy, England, Germany, Switzerland, and humbly from the USA, so 2 from Germany. And at the end, the students, when I showed them these slides, they wanted to extend their project a little bit. So I made cards with a paragraph on the back that explains the project and Archipelagos Italia and the role that Dr. Bondone had with them in helping them on this project. And they're going to be for sale at the bookstore next fall. And I know that more awareness is going to be raised than money for the project on the photo identification. But it closed a loop for this class, that after an exhibition comes down and work is returned, that their research and the beauty of their paintings could educate and continue. And these are available. I can send some to you. We're selling them for $1.50, and I'd be happy to send them to anybody who is interested. This is the last slide. I'm going to close with this slide because I've been teaching art history for a while, and I came across this slide on the internet while I was doing some research. And the image of the harp seal all the way over on the left is a dead ringer for Rembrandt's 17th century Syndics of the Cloth Guild, the man in the left, and then the center figure reminds me of the person who's just getting out of his chair. But the point here is that we've interrupted these syndics, these people who are businessmen in 17th century Holland. And we're also interrupting the seals with our impact on the land. And I think we need to be always mindful here of our impact and awareness, and our physical awareness of how much plastic we use, what products we consume, and how we can best hold each other's hands and try to spread the word and raise awareness and hopefully help these monk seals and other creatures, whatever aquatic creatures, whether we're in the Gulf of Maine, the Mediterranean, or anywhere else in the wide blue ocean. So that's all I have to say. And I think what we can do now is, I'm going to stop sharing, give it back to you at the Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and perhaps open for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara. Wow, that was so captivating and inspiring. I got goosebumps at different times. And thank you for taking us on that journey with your own artwork and travels, and then also all the—
Well, thank you. I realize. Well, thanks. I could see that I'm not really good with all this technology. We're not pros, that's for sure. And I know I got my paper in the way a couple of times, but here I am. I'm back. And I think if people have questions, if it's been in the chat, maybe I can answer them. And we have Dr. Bundone here also, who is staying up late just for us. And I appreciate that. And he can answer questions as well. So welcome, Luigi. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thanks for your amazing presentation. So let me put some more light here.
Ah, there you are. I can see you now.
Yeah, may I only add something?
Yeah.
Because Barbara expressed her point of view very amazingly, but you know, conservation of nature need to be understood. Well, everything we know is how we can perceive the information. So conservation of nature need to be understood. And most of the time environmentalists have alerting way to let you perceive the problem, and maybe even too alarming. It is, we are in a very difficult situation, and it is really alarming, but the most important thing is to understand without any fear, just to be free of your curiosity, understand the problem, and try to change the world a little bit. And little by little, make big changing. I mean, plastic is a big problem. It's not just question of do separate garbaging to protect the environment. We have to stop producing it. But we can do that only if we teach our younger what is important. It's better have a plastic bottle with Coca-Cola or whatever, or a nice environment. Let them know what is outside, especially for people that don't have the chance to feel it. Or I think that all the students of Barbara are very lucky. I see one question.
Yeah, that's a good one. Did you see it at the bottom?
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. Yes, a lot actually.
Let's repeat the question.
Yeah. If I learn or discover anything from the question that the student raised, I did see different point of view, because I'm into my field, my things, and occasionally I don't look to other possibility. For instance, one of the questions I remember the most was the one of the heart rate, because I don't even ever think about it. I mean, it was something I simply don't care. Let's say.
Let me jump in here, Luigi, because I loved it because you were on the Skype call, and after I had just said to the students, remember what I said, no stupid questions, nothing you can look up on your own. And that student that was pictured in the slide talk, the first thing he said to Dr. Bundone is, hi, you know, he told his name, and he said, I would like to know if you know the resting heart rate of the adolescent monk seal. And I watched you laugh because you hadn't thought of it before. But he was impressed. He was impressed because you got back to him in 40 minutes.
But you know, the thing is that even if it was something I never think about, I try to put myself into the student mind and why he was curious of that. And the fact that he got curiosity, it was a sufficient reason to open a new field. I'm more into photo identification, so there are some aspects of heart rate that I read, but I don't focus on that. But the way other people can perceive the problem might include also this aspect, because we all live with our heart rate. We know that if it stops, it's a big problem. So I can totally understand. I mean, some questions were, all the questions were very amazing, actually. All the students did really the job. But this one impressed me a lot because just let me think, yeah, why I don't know that? I have to know it. And actually, there are very few studies on that. But I said to Barbara, what was his name? I forget the name of the student.
Josh.
Josh.
It was Josh. Yeah.
Josh. I did my duty and immediately sent back the article. I have a very nice Bible.
Well, that was another lesson for, I mean, adolescents learn things that everything that we do. And he came racing up to my room after lunch and he said, Mrs. Putnam, Dr. Bundona got back to me in 40 minutes with an email. That's pretty impressive. And that carries forward with kids. That has weight. Are there other questions did anybody raise their hand?
Let's see.
Kids are the best audience.
You have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or raise your blue hand and I can unmute you. While we're waiting for some questions, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any plans to collaborate in the future?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. And actually, I had a few extra slides I can show you if you want what we're actually doing right now, but I cut it out of the talk because I thought it was going to be too long. Would you like me to show you? There's five slides I could show you if you want. Okay.
We have 7 minutes left, and meanwhile, if people have questions, they can add them to the chat box, but go right ahead.
Also, right, she will never get rid of me.
That's great. Okay, well, this is what Luigi doesn't know is we decided to collaborate, and so this is in April during COVID. I started dyeing fabric, and you can see I love it on the line, and this is the first step. And Luigi is interested in trying to document the seals on the western side, and they're really working on a complex problem in the Mediterranean because when you think about it, think of the countries that border the Mediterranean, and there's numerous languages, stakeholders are all different, every country has fishermen, and so the conservation problems are complex enough. And then if you're trying to work with governments to photo ID, that's even more complex, and then to have that translated. So I started dyeing fabric, and I started thinking that I could probably collaborate and do it best with cloth because I'm not there to draw any of the animals directly. So Luigi sent me a bunch of folders. He's also a pretty good teacher. He sent me a bunch of folders with, I'd say 1,000 images in them of a cave. And he said, try this, see what you can do with these. So I looked at them. This is one I nicknamed the Airbnb because there are so many seals here. They just kept coming and going. And what I learned from seeing that was basically that the seals don't seem too territorial. He'll probably correct me, I don't know, but they come and go from these different places and they show up in different caves. And it took me a week looking at these caves, drawing and drawing and drawing to come up with what I thought was the victory, which was not the whole thing, which was a composite. When you look at a seal from a bunch of different angles, and then you come up with an image that kind of reflects the shape of, the curve of the body. And it was a male. And then Luigi showed me his work. And he said, okay, here's one of the catalog pages for Yanis. And that's one marker. But if you're going to see a seal in the water, you may have a fraction of a second to be able to identify it. So you need to find markers on the head and on the side and other places so that you'll know who that seal is. And that was huge for me because it made me realize that I look with my eyes for light and shadow and form and mass and energy. And Dr. Bondone looks at other variables and maybe scars or whether there's algae or if the seal is wet or dry. And he has to work very quickly. And I understand why he talks in the possessive. That's one of my seals. He knows these seals. They're a catalog on the computer, but they're also a catalog in his head. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to try to tell this story with cyanotype. And so this is because it's underwater. So I needed to get a look and the blue of cyanotype, which is a photographic process, kind of like the old blueprints that you guys may remember of taking my fabric that I've dyed and dipping it into a solution, a photographic solution, letting that dry in the dark, and then taking it outside and exposing it to the sun with everything from netting to apple tree branches and chains from a boatyard. And I even took apart a bird feeder to get these kinds of images. So then that's the beginning. And going down to the beach, a piece of plexiglass separates the cloth from getting the wet seaweed, which would start the photograph to develop. And this one is what it yielded. That was 2 dips in the photo process to get 2 different exposures of the seaweed. So this is messy, but somewhat and chaotic, but this is the studio. And I have batting up there on the wall, and that's what I use on the inside of quilts, but it's sticky because the batting is cloth. So I can go up with these little mosaics that I cut up, and I can rotate them, turn them upside down and sideways. And I'm creating this kind of sense of the underwater garden, which is where these monk seals go. And I don't know if any of this is going to be in the final version, but I'm experimenting with it. And this is a little bit closer, so you can see that I've done a lot of photographs of plastic bags to get a sense of the plastic on the left kind of floating in the ocean. There's no 2 squares that are from the same piece of cloth, really. But I find a really interesting challenge, and each square is a brush stroke. So in putting these down, I want the eye to sometimes match up with the form as it goes to the next block. And sometimes I want the eye, when you stand way back, to skip over several blocks and see it come out as though it's woven underneath that the set of mosaics. And as you can see in the bottom, some of the things I'm auditioning there in the lower right are some of the tools I've been photographing. And believe it or not, the tools like that red swatch in the left are sometimes making their way in as actual pieces of something that would be vegetation. So this has got quite a ways to go, but that's as far as I've been able to take it. With COVID, I've been busy working on remote learning program for school for next fall. But that's all the slides I truly have.
Barbara, that was so beautiful. Super, super cool. We have a couple of questions that have come in, if you would like to answer them, and then a really beautiful comment from Anne just telling you how much you have inspired her.
Okay. Should we look at Colleen's question? Colleen, I should introduce, is somebody who does all those incredible podcasts for the Union of Concerned Scientists. And if people haven't been on that website, go run now, because she's incredible. She's also an artist, and I've dyed fabric with her. She's asking, as always, Barb has been always fascinated with science. Dr. Bundone, have you always had a love of art? And she thinks the collaboration's inspiring, but I would add to that question of Dr. Bundone, how were you introduced to art? Because that's something I don't know.
Well, my family, my mother is a teacher of art, was teacher of art, and we were always exposed as child to art. And then when I was a teenager, I started to be very interested into surrealism, Dadaism, all the youngish stuff. And then in Venice, you are so exposed to art that unless you are dead inside, you do react. I think that Barbara and myself, we just had a chance to meet. We were supposed to be friends, because we are 2 sides of the same coin, starting from 2 different, but trying to also go on the other way around, look on a new, on a different view, and having the chance to have I mean, it's not just a question of trying to change your perspective, but also have a person with the same intent, but starting from the other side. So I think we do match. we were searching for each other, and we find. That's right. The lucky thing. Also, can I just answer to Beth very fast?
Thank you.
She makes a very good question on genetic variability. Well, there are studies. I don't really believe genetic variability. Yes, it's very low, can be a problem, but actually there are some examples that also bottleneck, kind of a genetic bottleneck, and not just genetic bottleneck species can get better. For instance, the northern elephant seal were left to few specimens in the beginning of 2 centuries ago, and then it grew up to now you see in San Francisco up top. I don't remember the highest they went, but more than 1,000 kilometers up north, recolonizing everything. So I don't think that between the main problem for the monk seal was direct killing that started long ago. Although we have, I will not exclude as also genetic as a possible risk. Now we are challenged to look at everything.
Luigi sent me a couple of books to read in PDF form, and one was about the Roman Empire, which they seem to take many of the numbers down for the things that they did. And remember, that was the whole Mediterranean at that time. Yeah. And then also in the Renaissance, the same thing of ready target and useful for many purposes. So we can't completely blame ourselves in the present tense, but maybe our distant ancestors, and hope from thinking about that room full of scientists that we can make a difference.
If I can add very briefly, unfortunately, the Romans were the one that start with what we call the modern thinking, putting man on top of nature. Before them, most of the population have a higher respect. And actually, some of the science were because of that respect. Geometry, mathematics belong from the Egyptian start, from the Egyptian and the Greek, to respect nature and understand it. The Romans start to focus on mankind, and so it was in Renaissance. And now United States, we talk about race differences, but you are a European. You are the kid of Europe exporting the same knowledge, and the Chinese copy the same thought. So we are one world, but unfortunately, the one word especially copy the bad side as well as the good side. So we amplify everything in good and bad. I'm actually in a town, Venice, that do show how the great thing mankind can do are still visible. The same we can do in trying to be more respectful and not put ourselves too much on top of nature, but we breathe, we eat, we drink, and this is from nature. Money is not from nature. We invented it, so we have to be careful. Okay, sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you. Thank you both. I am conscious of time. It's 5:04, but if anyone has any other questions that they would like to ask our presenters, we could take 1 or 2 minutes to do that. Otherwise, thank you both so much. And if you wanted to send me PDFs, Barbara, of your lesson plans, or Luigi and Barbara, if you had resources that you'd like to share, including information about those beautiful cards that your students made, or any other information about the seals, I can embed that information into follow-up emails to participants, so they will get those along with the recording of the webinar.
Okay, I think I got all of that. I have for some reason, the humidity blew or something. I think I got everything, but what I heard was I'm going to get information to you about the lesson plans, and I would love to even work with other teachers who are interested in this, because I believe so firmly that this you can teach students basic skills of drawing and observation, but you can do it with content that helps empower them for their own future, which they're going to be responsible for.
To use the present day words, let's do a cultural pandemic.
Yes,
a cultural not
pandemic.
Just killing ignorance, not people.
That's right. Yeah. That's a good idea. But I'll send that to you, Lander, for sure.
That would be great.
If everything will be good with Barbara, we'll update you on the upcoming development.
Yes.
Right. I will. Thank you for staying up so late.
Yeah, it was exciting.
That's wonderful. And Barbara, I already have several teachers in mind that I think would probably love this presentation. So I will be forwarding the recording to them as well. And they might have interest in reaching out if you're willing as well.
Super. No problem.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for tuning in. And I hope you all have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, bye, bye.
Ciao.
Bye.